running for office. They needed to be either natural-born citizens of the United States or citizens at the time of the ratification. The idea behind being within the territories of the United States for at least 14 consecutive years is that they wanted the president and the vice president to be sympathetic. And this term kind of comes up over and over again in the reading in the book. They wanted them to be sympathetic to the needs of the American people, to the plight of the American people, to the requirements and the needs of the American people. They didn't want the person to, even if they were a citizen of the United States, they didn't want them to come over from Europe to become president, because there's a possibility that they might have allegiances to foreign powers. They wanted that sympathy. Earlier drafts of the Constitution used terms that, for example, male masculine terms referring to he, definitely masculine terms. The final draft of the Constitution, all those were removed. So, as a matter of fact, the Anti-Federalists argued during the ratification debates that there's a chance that a woman could become president someday because of the way the language that was used within the Constitution. It was gender neutral. The president had a salary. And the reason behind having a salary during those times, those periods, because if you read Benjamin Franklin, if you read Thomas Jefferson and Adams, excuse me, I'm getting all the historical characters mixed up here. They, especially Benjamin Franklin, he believed that public service should be voluntary. That you shouldn't get any kind of compensation for it. That it was part of your civic duty. The reason why they talked about salary for the president is they wanted to make sure that a person of modest means could be president. So in other words, a person who was not wealthy, if he or she took on that responsibility as president, they might be destitute, because they basically left their business behind to come to the Capitol and serve as the executive with no kind of compensation. So they ensured that there would be some sort of compensation. They wanted the office of the presidency to be independent from Congress. And they also, in the Constitution, talked about that the Congress could not change the salary during the term. So in other words, and this is seen a couple different times throughout the Constitution, a limitation on changing or altering the salary. You think about it, if you have a president that's not doing exactly what you want, or if you have a judge on the Supreme Court that's not doing exactly what you want, what's the first way that you might show some kind of retribution? You reduce their salary, or you eliminate it altogether. So they wanted to make sure that Congress wouldn't be able to play politics when it came to the salary. The president couldn't receive any other kind of salary or fee or profit from the nation or from the states. So in other words, again, they're trying to strive for some independence in the office. Didn't want other influences coming in. The oath was meant to be a very solemn and kind of convey the gravity of the situation of taking office. And I don't know if I completely agree with this, but this is what the author, Rob Nadelson, was saying, that even misdeeds might have potential consequences in the afterlife. I don't think any of our people in Washington have those kinds of concerns these days. The enumerated powers in general, there's some similarities, as I mentioned earlier, there's some similarities to the British Crown. But unlike the Crown, or unlike the King, the President had veto power. He did not have power to declare war. That was something Congress had to do. He did have treaty-making power, but it was required that the Senate would approve treaties. He couldn't appoint senators, and he could not employ congressmen in his service. In other words, the founders wanted a separation between the legislative branches and the executive branch. Let's see. I already read all that. Oh, I thought I deleted that one. I'm sorry. I'd added one other line. I forgot to delete the earlier slide, but there's basically 16 enumerated powers, and some of which are legislative powers. It kind of blurred the lines just a little bit. The incidental powers. Incidental powers are implied powers. In other words, if a power is defined, you have to also be able to create rules to support that power. Veto was what they refer to as a revisionary power. In other words, if a piece of legislation comes to the president, there's a few different things the president can do with it. He can sign it into law. He can sit on it, and after 10 days, I believe it's 10 days or more, it will just automatically become law if he doesn't object to the piece of legislation, but also doesn't sign it. He can veto it and not return it to Congress, or he can veto it and return it to Congress. So there's two different types of vetoes. The veto powers have three basic purposes. To block legislation designed to serve special interests. I don't think presidents have been vetoing those too often. To reduce the chance of unconstitutional law. So in other words, the president was looked upon in that sense as kind of like the final check and balance to make sure laws are constitutional. And to defend the independence of the executive branch. So he's looking after his own interests as well. Some of his domestic powers, for example, it talks about on extraordinary occasions, he could call Congress back into session, or actually in this case, it's to adjourn Congress if they do not, cannot agree to adjourn. Actually, yeah, call them back into session under extraordinary occasions. He's supposed to deliver a State of the Union message. It doesn't talk about how often or when, but it's kind of like a report about what's going on within the country. Make recommendations to Congress. In the Constitution, it talks about such measures as he shall deem necessary and expedient. So it's very similar to the necessary and proper clause that Congress lives under. He can pardon non-state criminals, in other words, federal criminals. And he can also pardon people that are being impeached. He can appoint judges, demand department reports, supervise executive employees, prescribe rules and conduct for those employees. Executive branch officers, other than the vice president, were all created and paid for by Congress. So there's kind of this overlap there between the executive and the legislative branches of government. Presidential appointments for permanent positions, like department heads, for example, are subject to Senate approval. And that falls under the advice and consent. If you remember from last week, when we were talking about Congress, talking about the Senate in particular. They have a relationship with the executive branch to be able to provide advice and consent. George Washington, for example, went to Congress numerous times throughout his administration. Just for that very reason, advice and consent. You know, here's the problem that we're dealing with on a national level. What do you guys think we should do about it? If the president wants to appoint someone during a recess,